This video is brought to you by BTI Institute, a New Jersey leader in certification-based management training.
Quickly introduce ourselves, Randy. So you may have seen me on these a lot of times. I've got a lot of acronyms behind my name. I'm a bit of a nutcase, and I tell Randy and other people, don't do what I do just for all the certifications and the training, but I enjoy it. If you have that mindset, great. I've been an Agile coach for many years. I work with several teams, just forming, just starting up, to people who've already been struggling, and I've seen it all, everybody skyrocketing, to teams that have tanked. Work with the financial institutes, life sciences, and I'm currently with a pharmaceutical company. Randy, tell us a little bit about yourself over here.
Well, let's see. I like acronyms too, but I'm trying to stay just in a narrow, agile tooling environment with SAFE. That's it. There's so many frameworks, so many tools that, it's, at least I'm finding it helpful just to stay focused in one area. But yeah, no, I was at a company in New York for the last 5.5 years, helping with the transformation, or leading the transformation from a waterfall setting to SAFE using the Scaled Agile framework. And so lots of great stories and experience from that. And I'll always be grateful for that time. It was awesome, great relationships there. But sometimes you reach a point in your career where change is important too. And I had been teaching part-time at BTII for the past 5 years, virtually on weekends, virtually all the time I was in New York. And I found I liked it more, and just decided to, they offered an arrangement. So I'm now a full-time instructor at BTII.
Great. So with that, we do have an agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about the flavors of scaling, SAFE being one of them. A few of the popular ones we see are LESS, Scrum at Scale, Scale Professional Scrum. Before we get into the roadmaps with Randy, what are the roadmaps? Where do we start? Why are they valuable? How are they created? So a lot of good nuggets out here, including the types of roadmaps and building solutions. So with the flavors of scaling, allow me to say that while SAFE is quite popular, we had some others way back. Craig Larman and Bas Bodie had LESS, and they had two flavors of that, the less huge being one of them, if you had a multitude of teams working at a program level. And they have a great site called less.works. And some of it also outlines what's different between the core of Scrum versus some of the modifications. And with all of these scaling models, you're going to find that it borrows a lot from Scrum, or leverages a lot from Scrum. We also have Scrum at Scale that's overlooked by Scrum Inc. Dr. Jeff Sutherland was very kind, and he presented over here as well a couple of months ago. And he really got into the heart of agility and the philosophy of scaling over here. We also have something called Scale Professional Scrum through scrum.org that's overlooked with, or by Ken Schraber. I actually have a soft corner here because I was amongst the first in a classroom when he taught this course with David Starr, and I was designated as what we call as a plank owner. At that time, they did not have certifications for this, but it's evolved, and it's known as the Nexus. So you've got a few things out there under the flavoring, but where does SAFE fit in? So looking at some industry surveys, this is the CollabNet version 1 13th annual survey. We can see that SAFE is at 30% based on how people have responded. A lot of people don't even know, for example, at 19%, how they have scaled or if they could put a name to it. Then there's the Scrum of Scrums, amongst other things. Large scale Scrum or less is at 3% that I talked about. Nexus is at 2%. So again, with SAFe being ever popular, today Randy's going to talk a little bit more about that. And again, it's going to be hard to compare all these flavors of agility and scaling, and we're not going to do that today. And our hope is that you've had some exposure to some agile practices where you work with at least 2 or more teams, and they're starting to build up and ramp up and see what could be done at a greater level. So with that, I think, Randy, you're up. You're at the next slide.
All right, thank you, Nitin. Those are some of the topics really that I hope to cover and more, just to give us some flavor for the agenda and what we're trying to cover anyway. So I wanted to start with a joke. I like to start with something funny when I talk, and so I hope it's an adaptation of an existing joke. I kind of stole it a little bit, modified it, but so there was this project manager and developer working together on a project, and things got a little complicated. So there was a lot of back and forth between them and lack of clarification. So they decided to meet. And so the project manager said, hey, what's your address, right? And so the developer comes back and he says, it's 173.168.15.10. And he says, no, man, I mean your local address. So he says, oh yeah, that's 168.0.0.1. Says, look, dude, you geeky nerd, I mean your physical address. So he comes back with 29.1. So anyway, I hope we got that if we don't understand networking. All right, so in this, I can't see my notes the way this Zoom seems to be working out. So hopefully I've done this enough that I can just fill in the gaps for us. But so this is a typical product roadmap, and it's they come in many different forms, of course, and they're intended to give sort of a high-level vision of the direction a product is headed, not a commitment of anything, but a senior level, almost a strategic planning tool to give overall direction. What I found was kind of interesting in preparing for this is I looked through the PMBOK 6. I'm a PMP certified as well. And there was no reference at all to roadmaps. I found, again, I have my notes, but I think it was like page 216 in the PMBOK. There was a footnote and it was associated with agile release planning, but nothing in traditional project management about roadmaps. Surprised me. So I thought I would start with just to get some footing here a little bit, look at and contrast some of the differences here. So PMPers, we're more familiar with planning schedules and all of the activities associated with planning a project schedule, where you're developing the scope and the schedule management plan. You're sequencing the activities and things of that nature, right? But it's in PMBOK 6 that roadmaps are introduced to the PMBOK via the release planning section of the guide. So this idea that it starts with this high level way in which we break visions or decompose, got a fair amount of noise somewhere, but where visions are decomposed into things that are small enough for teams to build on. So of course we start with vision, which is the result of, we create initiatives from those visions that come out of strategic planning. They lead to roadmap requirements. And of course, we develop release plans. And at the release plan level is where we create features, and in SAFe, we call them epics. I think SCRUM somewhere references epics as well. They're very large descriptions of functionality, but they're still too big for teams to build things on. So in SCRUM, as you know, we further decompose them to user stories. And that's roughly analogous to the requirements that we see are being created in traditional projects. So roadmaps, right? So there's some key questions that we need to answer or think about at least. When will products be available for release, right? Obvious thing. And in SAFE, we call them themes that initiatives are driven from. So they're logical groups of features and requirements at the highest levels of the organization. And of course, as we saw in the last slide, they need to be broken down further. Or how much effort is involved with each feature. We have to estimate them, and we estimate them in story points. So roadmaps help identify things like, or we should look at market rhythms and how they impact when we choose to release. We'll define market rhythms a little bit more later, but there are a set of events that occur as expected. Like for example, in the fall, you want to prepare for the holiday season. So that would be sometime before that is when you want to release some major new product if you're in the retail space and so forth, right? So there are three critical reasons I think we should consider when talking about or discussing roadmaps. First is that roadmaps link strategic planning to implementation tactics. It's how we get things done from, this initiative was approved. How did we get it all the way to the point of where it could be funded and teams began to formulate and build stuff, right? Second, roadmaps facilitate discussion around options for achieving a future state. And thirdly, product roadmaps create alignment among the stakeholders, which guides the execution. So we're going to look at these three. So again, if up in the left corner here, you have the enterprise as it's depicted in SAFE, where the leadership of an organization, the steering committee, the board of directors, whatever it's called in your organization, conducts their annual or twice a year strategic planning, and they define initiatives that they believe will help the organization grow or sustain, right? And so those initiatives are broken into things called epics and SAFE. But epics are still very large. They need to be validated. So feasibility studies are done, market studies, competitive analysis, SWOT analysis, financial and cost analysis. Can we afford to build this thing? Does it make sense to build this thing? So the epic is assigned to what we call an epic owner who shepherds it through this portfolio Kanban to ultimately get a go or no-go decision on it. And if it's approved, then we fund what's called a lean agile budget. In other words, we have a construct in SAFE called a value stream. And once a charter is approved, that ultimately is the funding of the value stream. But once the value stream has access to the funds, then it manages the budget associated with that agile release train. So this process from end to end, from defining the initiatives to ultimately getting approved and the value stream funded, is what connects SAFE to the lean portfolio itself. But once the portfolio has it, then of course everything downstream can kick off. So who are the collaborators in this process? Well, again, there's the leadership of the company, but then assisting them really is the interfunctional and technical architects. We call it lean portfolio management, but that consists of people involved with strategy, agile operations, and governance. And then there are other portfolio stakeholders. So what are they talking about? Well, they are developing the vision, the strategy. This is the group that's defining those epics. They're evaluating them. They're doing cost estimates, defining targets, and ultimately making a go or no-go decision about moving ahead. Now, guys, I might stop here a moment just to say that, trying to complete this in 40 minutes or so, and there's a lot of material. So I may be moving a little fast, and I'll try to adjust and balance as we go here a bit. Based on those collaborators, right, what are some of the potential roles for us on the traditional project management side? Well, there's an agile PMO. It's really a traditional PMO that has decided to embrace agile practices and principles. And then there's a lean center, agile center of excellence in SAFE. Now, surprisingly, that's a special group at the leadership level who are really trying to talk the talk. So they're doing things like sprint planning, daily stand-up meetings and retros at this senior portfolio level so that teams downstream see that our leadership is actually practicing what they want us to practice. And of course, they're helping to facilitate all these best practices as well. There's also, again, lean portfolio managers, and that might be a traditional portfolio manager. The solution managers, these are functional and technical leadership at the program and portfolio level. So all of these roles here, and again, the important thing that I'm trying to point out here is that SAFE thinks about roles, not titles. So you'd be mapping what you do in your skill set to one of these roles to find a place in a company or an enterprise that's practicing scaled agile. Oftentimes, project managers facilitate or fill in as a Scrum Master role. They're different roles totally, and that's a whole different conversation beyond roadmaps today, but it's often one of the roles that we fill. So one of the tools that this leadership group uses is called a portfolio canvas. It helps us address number 2. Roadmaps facilitate discussions for achieving the future state. So this portfolio canvas, this is kind of a silly example. I think it's using an autonomous vehicle, delivery vehicle, but it shows the value proposition for this autonomous vehicle, some of the key activities, its partners, and so forth that it uses to, and so the document itself, this canvas itself, is like a talking document so that we're all looking at the same Bible, we're all reading and trying to understand and analyze this thing from a common document. So it facilitates the conversation. Now, again, in Agile, we don't need or try to know the full solution up front, but we want to know what the solution intent is. It's a repository for managing and communicating, all the knowledge, the artifacts, and everything that goes into ultimately making some kind of an initial design of what it is we want to build, or what this product or this epic is asking us to try and architect and ultimately build. So we only want to know the intent. It ultimately leads us to something we call the minimum viable product, but we don't need, unlike waterfall, where there's heavy upfront planning and all of the risk is placed at the end because we don't know until the product is delivered. In SAFE, we think of it as too much risk. So we only know the solution intent, and we're going to evolve and elaborate towards the ultimate solution. All right, so that brings us to number 3. Roadmaps create alignment, which guides the execution, right? So after this product management team has sort of defined the solution intent, Agile release trains are then created, and their role is to further define and actually develop and deploy the functionality. But now these epics have broken into features, and at that point, when the trains are taking over the development, we're breaking features into stories and even further granular to assist teams in building it, right? So ARTs operate as part of what we call the continuous delivery pipeline, which I'm going to address a little bit later, but essentially it's a way that while teams are building stuff, the architects are planning the next round of things. And when we're done, we're going to take over that round, and it continuously flows towards deployment and release on demand. We'll look at that in a moment. So before the train can really move, it needs to know where it's going, right? So Agile release trains deliver value based on a roadmap. That's its high-level guidance that helps us figure out where we're going and how we're going to do it. So let's explore that now. So there are 4 types of roadmaps. The first is called a solution roadmap. And it promotes clarity really in terms of long-range planning, and it helps product managers collaborate with portfolio managers. So these solution maps are really a sort of a 10 to 30 week horizon, where that first 10 weeks, that's pretty well defined, and that's what the teams are currently building. The things that are further out are sort of forecasted, and the teams will be working on that next. Then there is a PI roadmap. And the PI roadmap consists of a series of, well, they're called program increments, or PI, and a PI is typically 10 weeks and safe. So it'll look at or have well-defined the first program increment, and that's what the teams will plan and build on. It's not the entire solution, it's just one slice of it that represents about 10 weeks of work. While the program team members and architects, release train engineers, solution train engineers, they're working on the next round of functionality. There's a roadmap called the supported versions. Now, this roadmap promotes clarity in managing solutions that have multiple versions. So solutions that are deployed in sort of complex environments require this kind of specialized roadmap when there are multiple versions involved. Like, for example, Microsoft, we knew that their roadmap said Windows 7 would be retired or decommissioned in January. So, but you still have to support the prior versions or other versions while you're rolling a new one out. So there's this concept of supported versions roadmap. And then finally, the fourth is prune the product tree. And it's really a innovation game that's designed to help product managers work with their stakeholders to sort of flush out the details of what these features are, put some priority on them, and it becomes an input to a roadmap. So with those four in mind, let's take another slight look at them. So the first one, again, being the solution roadmap. Now it just sort of shows the milestones and when things are supposed to be delivered. But what it also shows is the epics. So we have this medical specimens epic that has a couple of features associated with it, but it shows what the non-functional requirements for delivering those features are. So for example, the one that says, follow the route. Well, before we can deliver that feature, the GPS component has to work. So that would be sort of a dependency before we could deliver that feature. But the roadmap is simply giving us some kind of timeline as to when things are supposed to be developed and deployed. Now, the PR roadmap, again, that's for a shorter cycle than the solutions roadmap. That first PI, the teams know exactly what they're going to build. But so there's some committed objectives and some uncommitted objectives. The committed objectives are based on the team's capacity, and there's some high degree of certainty that those features will be developed in this 10-week cycle. The uncommitted objectives are, they're telling the leadership up front that we believe we can get these done, but we're not sure. And the important thing is that it's communicated up front. And then so there's no hard expectation that it'll get done. It may need to carry over into the second program increment. So while the teams are building stuff in the current PI, the program level architects and engineers are planning the next round of functionality for PI2 and PI3. So those are more forecasted. But as we near the completion of PI1, teams will start to be introduced into the next round of things so that they can begin to plan. Now, the supported versions. So here we're seeing various releases over time, and that early versions have to be supported while we're launching or releasing new products. So standard roadmaps show up as upcoming features, but not what we're decommissioning. So we have to maintain the supported versions as we roll out new product. Now, prune the product tree, right? So the concept here is it's to assist, again, product management, working with architects, release trained engineers, solution architects who are looking at PI2 and PI3 and even further down the road. The idea is that the apples are features on the tree. The branches are capture related features. So any apples on that branch, all of those features are related. And the grass is sort of, in SAFE, what we call the architectural runway. And that sort of represents non-functional requirements that we have to build in advance of building the functional features. So the runway has to be enhanced in order for us to deliver certain functionality. Now, the farther the apples are away on the tree, then they can be done later. The things that are closer to the trunk has to be done sooner. And so if you can imagine this kind of brainstorming session, a tree with a whole bunch of apples on them, then it sort of gives us agreement, at least a talking place as to how we would end up ultimately restructuring or structuring our roadmap. So now there are basically two choices for how we construct them. They are growth-centric or time-centric. Now, growth-centric roadmaps emphasize balance and infrastructure, and we kind of saw that earlier with the autonomous vehicle and the follow route feature, where the non-functional requirement was the GPS enhancements. And then there is a time-centric roadmap. It highlights really the timeframes in which something has to be delivered. And so it's just that this sort of growth or prune the product tree is sort of good for brainstorming, but not good for actually building a roadmap that has multiple components. It's great for a single roadmap. All right, now, so understanding the scenarios that might impact your roadmap. So for effective roadmap planning, you got to ask some critical questions up front. Like, what if we lost our largest customer? Does it still make sense to try and push this product to market? Or what if the market demands an early release? Can we do it? Are we in position? Have we been planning or structuring the application at least so that we could incrementally release certain components early? And then what if we acquire one or more competitors? How does that factor in? Do we still even need to be concerned about an initial launch until we look at what those products offer and how to merge them into what we're currently doing? And then finally, what if regulatory changes impact us? And now our release is sort of thrown off totally because we have to address this regulatory or compliance requirements. So external factors can have an impact on our roadmaps, and we have to think about that as leadership. Teams are just working away building things, but when features are released, should come from the guidance of the leadership. So market rhythm and market events influence roadmaps, right? So here's an example, right? So a market rhythm helps to identify value and when we have the best opportunity to obtain the greatest value from a release, right? So this chart is trying to show us that, for example, that all through that first area of the first couple of quarters, we could release anytime we want, really. And then, but if we're in the retail business and we know the fourth quarter is a big time for our product, then we probably want to release a little bit early before we enter into the fourth quarter, right? So that's because our highest value will be earned. So that kind of spike, we know that's a market rhythm. We know it's coming. So that's the idea of market rhythms, is that These are events that we know is going to happen, and we plan for them. We plan when we should release. Again, teams aren't thinking about this, but as leadership, we have to think about these kind of issues. Market milestone is another example. So that would be, again, that's a known event, but that's something that probably we control. That's internal to our organization. Maybe there's a big trade show that we're trying to, that we are going to be at, our competitors are going to be at. We know they're probably going to release sometime in the third quarter. We want to beat them to market. So we're going to release a little bit early. But trade shows and events like that that are known, or we have some insight and we know and can anticipate when a competitor intends to release, then things like that all go into our planning of our roadmaps. Another great tool that we use, it's called the Impact Effort Matrix, and we use it for forecasting when we're going to release product. But it has to do, we have to know the size and effort associated with these things. So for example, if we have a bunch of features up in the left quadrant, we know those features bring us more value, but they're slightly smaller. The ones up in the upper right corner, we know they bring a lot of value, but they're much larger effort. Should we do those first, or should we try and get some things out faster that are smaller effort, but less value, but it gives us a place to build on. So again, the architects of the planning and working with product management about when and how we release and things of that nature, these are the kinds of tools and the roles that are involved in this kind of discussion that of course impacts our roadmap and when we want to plan to release. And then there is sort of this overall roadmap that sort of shows when we're defining things, we're developing things, and it's not intended to be sort of sequential like this, where it looks waterfallish. It's more of just how I animated it. It's intended to really show us leadership at its highest level, what the plans are and when things are supposed to happen. And then they use it to monitor progress as part of what lean portfolio management does to ensure that teams are meeting their commitments and so forth, right? All right, so finally, back to the continuous delivery pipeline. Now, it represents in SAFE, it represents the workflows and the activities and the automation that's needed to sort of get a new piece of functionality from its very beginning, its idea, to releasing it on demand to the end user. So this first part of the continuous delivery pipeline is called exploration. And it's where all of the planning occurs. So a lot of all the big ideas, no matter where they come from, flow into the organization through what's called a funnel. And it's all it goes through processes where product management and others are evaluating it to assess whether or not it makes sense for the organization to look at it further. So we welcome the ideas, we welcome all great ideas, no matter where it comes from, into continuous exploration. But certain ideas are then looked at closer, and they are large enough that we declare them as epics or major features, and they need full vetting. So we assign them to an owner, and they do the analysis and requirements and market studies and so forth to ultimately get a decision on whether or not it makes sense to continue to build it. Maybe it's a competitive threat, something we have to match, right? Or compliance. But everything starts with exploration. This is where the planning occurs. And then next, this is where continuous integration focuses on taking features from the program backlog, which was developed in continuous exploration, and we bring it in for implementation. So we're now in the execution phase of the continuous delivery pipeline. So this is where teams really are building stuff. They're building and testing and validating the functionality that was brought into a program increment. Execution. Some of the roles here, again, some of the same roles we talked about earlier, but it's about mapping our titles and what we're interested in to the various roles in the SAFE framework. So we may fit into the PMO, we may fit into the LACE, we may be an architect, it could be the release train engineer, or even higher level than that, the solution train engineer. Again, there's not a lot of time to go into a lot of detail about this stuff, but the solution level and product level are different levels in SAFE. They represent, we're looking at, for example, in this picture, a single agile release train. But a solution train would consist of multiple agile release train. And in SAFE, a train, it's one train would contain up to about 125 people working in collaboration to deliver a product. So multiple trains forming solution trains scale up to the very largest product requirements or enterprise requirements. So that's the sort of the scalability that's built into the framework. It just, you keep creating agile release trains and solution trains to scale up to whatever level your enterprise demands for that product. And then finally next to final, there's a continuous deployment part of the continuous delivery pipeline. And it takes changes from the staging environment and deploys it to production. So the way that we try to architect applications in SAFE is so that they can be released on demand. So the continuous deployment process contains a number of toggles, or we call them feature toggles, or dark launches and tools of that nature. The application has to be architected so that we can release on demand. The big concept is the separation of deployment from release on demand, so that we're continuously deploying. The idea is that after every single iteration, potentially a feature can be deployed right into production, but exposing it is another thing. That is, we can release on demand. So we separate in SAFE, or we try and architect our applications so that we can continuously deploy, but only release when it's needed or when there's demand for it. So release on demand is the ability to make value available to customers all at once, or in some staggered fashion, or based on when the market needs it, but on demand. So every iteration, we're pushing more and more value into production. I mean, of course, it's going through all of the traditional stages from development to your QA environment. It's going to your SIT, or systems integration environment, test environment. It's going through UAT, and it's going through staging. So we'll go through all of the normal cycles, but through continuous integration and continuous deployment, our goal is to push it all the way to the production setting, but not expose it until it's been fully validated. So let's try to summarize here really quickly, right? So roadmaps link strategic planning to implementation tactics, right? It's the idea that from strategic planning, we want the entire organization aligned with those strategic plans. So the visions are broken into feature epics and features, and they ultimately are vetted and validated until they receive funding approval. It creates alignment with the entire organization that ultimately built it. There's governance along the road that's facilitated by a lean Agile Center of Excellence or an Agile PMO to make sure teams are hitting their KPIs and delivering the value that they're expected to deliver. And there are these 4 types of roadmaps. Of course, there's a solution roadmap that helps us focus on the markets and the epics and the enablers, and PR roadmaps at a shorter duration. But it is where we build stuff immediately while we're planning the next cycle as part of the continuous delivery pipeline. And when designing roadmaps, we want to choose a time or growth strategy. and traditional PMs can fit into many of the agile roles. But some of the key to us, if you're currently involved in an organization that's transforming or planning to, or has some form of agile projects going on, you have to understand how the framework works. And so it's just important to, either through internal training or external training, that you reach out for some of that, because you can be quite a bit more effective in your environment with that kind of training. So guys, with that, again, I had to run through all of this without my notes. I hope I didn't go too fast for us, but it should leave us time for some follow-up. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Nitin.
Hi, this is Emerson Simon. I've met all of you all at various meetings, Randy included. I think, Randy, I may have asked you this question at the last meeting, but my company, we're based in Switzerland. And I've noticed that over in Europe, this thing about agile shift is now kind of like, coming into play. At least I just heard about it a couple of weeks ago. Wondering if you guys have heard anything about that.
Yeah, we kind of, you and I chatted a little bit about that the other day. I didn't look into it, but that's a whole brand new concept for me. Agile shift. Have Nitin or Bob, you guys heard anything about that?
No,
Agile shift. Yeah.
I know Agile has been shifting a lot of people, but not that term. I'm not familiar with it.
But we are all inspired now to look into it since you brought it up again. It must be a real issue.
Well, I just started seeing it popping up, and I'd never heard of it, and I was just curious,
Yeah.
Yeah, I do have to say that I go back to the core of Scrum. Again, Scrum just being one of the flavors of agility, but it just still remains to be ever popular. And it's a light framework, and people have built upon it or try to modify it, that you hear these other things. So I would just exercise a little caution with the curiosity to what that shift is. The shift sounds positive in some ways. When you say shift, I hope it's heading towards the positive direction, because I think of change and it can be intimidating, but a shift might be a nice light touch to, hey, we're trying something different. Here's what it could be.
Or it could be a crazy acronym too.
I just sort of.
Okay, I got to Google this now.
I just Googled the topic, and there's an Agile Shift conference. So it must be taking shape somewhere out there, but and another website called agileshift.com. All right, so we had another project to look at, guys, and figure out what that is.
Hey, Randy, this is Henry Will, and I posted a question there, but before I do, I want to say congratulations to Nitin and Bob. They were at the last chapter meeting recognized as the volunteer team, and they were given an award for that. So I'm sure John will be talking about that more, but congratulations to both of you for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And my question was about, you mentioned about ways that project managers can transform into some of these positions. And I was wondering if you were familiar with any stories of project managers transitioning to some of these roles, and which ones have you found that they've been, or heard that they've been more successful at?
Yeah, oftentimes what I've seen over the couple of years really is project managers becoming Scrum Masters, but I've seen at least two fail at it. And so success is easy, positive story, but let's be cautious about the failures. And the failure, some of the symptoms or characteristics had to do with what you almost would expect, because it's a whole change in mindset to be a Scrum Master versus the skill set you're involved in as a Scrum Master, as a project manager, right? So we now, in this role, you're a facilitator. You're a servant leader, trying to help the team.
Randy, you were cut off on those last couple sentences.
Yeah, so the idea here is that you're a servant leader as a Scrum Master. You facilitate processes and help drive the team from that perspective, but no one reports to you. And that's a huge shift from a traditional project manager. And the two that I have unfortunately had to be involved in, we let go. They just could not make the transition. But otherwise, I mean, if you have significant domain experience, like some project managers after working 10 or 15 years supporting a product, have significant domain experience. They can be a product owner, or product manager, they could be a solution architect. So it really kind of depends on what you've accomplished with your career so far, but the roles.
There's a question from Seth Weinstein. Any thoughts on how to prevent roadmaps from becoming project plans, i.e. guiding but not locking down future features in the eyes of the product owner / business?
Yeah, that's absolutely a great question, and it's coordinated through project management. And so the way you really can avoid it is regular communication with your portfolio group. So we have again, I'm answering questions within the context of the SAFE framework. And so there's a solution level and a program level for product managers. They are the ones responsible for the roadmaps and socializing it, making sure that everyone up and downstream understand that this is not a commitment. The roadmap is not a commitment. It's a directional document that guides us toward the solution. And so if we're effective at that, then we can avoid that kind of problem.
Is there any other questions?
Hi, this is Mike Ella. I had a question on, so we're kind of operating, and I think we talked about this probably in one of the other sessions. It's more of a, combination of the waterfall and agile, right? So as we still have some processes in place, specifically more around funding requirements and the financials of the project, right? Kind of looking at that, at the overall cost of the project. And that makes sense in some places because it's, decisions on whether or not you even go ahead and do that. You kind of want to know your own cost. But then at that point, it's like, I'm just wondering, like within an agile framework, and I saw before you had some mention of some of the financial pieces there. I would envision more that you would be kind of running these smaller pieces, and then that would be informing the decision to continue to fund, and that you're actually working in a value stream kind of process that's saying, yes, I've gotten value out of this, and yes, I'm going to continue to go down there because this project's delivering against what I expected to do. So is that clear and a question kind of?
Yeah, if I can maybe repeat it back to sort of see if I have at least parts of the question. So it's all about costs and maybe how do we manage and track costs related to an agile project. I think that's at least part of it, because there's the funding piece up front where we fund the value stream. But once the value stream is funded, what happens to the funds? How do we manage and account for it, right? And so once it's funded, now teams that gives the portfolio management group, we call it LPM, Lean Portfolio Management, authorization to spin up agile release trains. So these trains are up to 125 people. So during the process of validating the EPIC to get funding approved, an initial budget was established. And it's based on historical experience. So these are senior executives that have been there, done that. And so they know it's large enough that it's a $5 million project over 2.5 years. I mean, you get some initial sense of funding. The thing in SAFE though is that, and I don't know if people quite appreciate it, it's not like if the EPIC was approved for $5 million, that they drop a $5 million check and say, go have fun. No, it's more like what we have to do first is build and architect what's called the MVP, the minimal viable product. And that's to get feedback. We call that learning curve, learning cycles. So as we get feedback and the pot, it's headed in the right direction, based on the solution intent of the MVP, we'll get another round of funding. And so we continuously evolve it by adding to the minimal viable product. And at some point, we say after 1 or 2 PIs, this makes sense, the corporation or enterprise wants to invest in it. And so we allow the funding to go through the rest of the development. But still, one more point then, I'll wrap that up quickly, is that, so once we're actually executing, we're in continuous delivery pipeline now, everything is based on team performance metrics. So we plan in story points and we measure in story points. So a team that is planning 180 story points per PI and they're delivering, well, maybe 170, well, we consider that probably pretty good progress. And so as long as teams on the train are delivering at least 90% of their plan, maybe some groups feel it a little bit less or more, but as long as we're in that vicinity, the product continues to build. So we measure and account for it through concepts like velocity at a team level and a PI level and so forth. I hope that sort of touches it. I mean, I was telling Nitin, I've spent the last 3 weeks preparing for an exam. And this course is all about how we cost products from the strategic planning through implementation. So it's a whole topic that I can only barely touch on for the moment, but that sort of gives you hopefully some flavor for it.
Yeah, thanks. I think just to follow on to there, the one gap that I think I'm seeing is, and it sounds like as you were talking through there, the entire process and the way that the organization structures, if you're going to be truly agile, sort of has to be on board with that. So, we still have some, especially, I don't want to get too detailed, but like some stuff with offshore and moving people and stuff like that, you actually have to make some longer commitments for time. So you're cutting POs that are kind of outside of a single sprint. You might be looking at the entire duration of the project. So you need to get approval for that funding. And then the way the organization structure, there's some built-in overhead with that, as well as far as some other pieces that come in. So our cost got way out of whack. And my piece that I guess I was hoping to get out of this would have been that if we would have kind of gone through more incrementally,